This is the Dungeon Master's Handbook. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Dungeon Master's Handbook. I'm Michael Shorten, Chicago Wiz, and I'm glad you are joining me here today. This episode is actually going to be kind of hard to talk about because I'm going to be talking about something visual. I'm going to be talking about maps and how I do mapping in my campaign. Cover a little bit about the tools I use and about the different types of maps that I do. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll have an idea of what I've done and how maybe picked up some tips and tricks that you can take into your campaign. I will put up some links on the description of this podcast and on the WordPress blog about the various maps that I have and the tools that I use. So stay with us and hope you get something out of this episode. So as I've talked about, my first hex maps for my current AD&D campaign started off really small. There were only 3 hexes that I filled in. But even back then, I had fallen in love with a tool that I've continued to use for almost a decade now. I went on the web and on the various forums back in 2009 to try and find a good hex mapping tool, and there were some more common ones that people had heard about, Campaign Cartographer and things like that. But then there was this guy who was advertising a shareware of all things, a blast from the past, a shareware version of a application called Hexographer. And it was very easy to use. It was very much click and pick the terrain type and pick what you wanted in the hex, and it printed nicely and it exported to images and it worked beautifully. And I went ahead and started using it. As I mentioned, I started off with 3 hexes, which were about the 24 miles or give or take, basically the length of a day's walk, and that grew to be a map the size of 250 hexes wide by 125 hexes tall, and this is an entire continent. I've said that it's about the size of what Russia would be, and when you convert to miles, it's actually pretty close. I would, by my calculation, take about a game year for you to walk from one end to the other. And I have every hex with some sort of terrain in it. Not necessarily features or villages or towns, but I have the overall layout. Since then, Hexographer has become a new program called Worldographer. And the new version I'm really excited about because it allows for parent-child map relationships within the same file. So if I ever wanted to, say, drive down into a more detailed hex map, the new version of Worldographer will let me do that. And you can do other things like take notes, you can create borders, you can create the rivers and coastlines and fractals now, not just the actual hex edges. You can also do really cool things like hide and show objects, which will come into play when I talk about creating my player's map. So if there are things that I want to have by default hidden unless I check an option, I can do that with Hexographer and everything's there. Definitely recommend you give this tool a look-see. Joe over at Inkwell Ideas is very accessible, really open to ideas. He just had a Kickstarter where he upgraded Hexographer to version 2.0 and changed it into Worldographer. And the tool's just really matured, and I'm really thrilled that he's kept it up and running. So as I mentioned, out of this map, I actually have 2 versions. Well, to be honest, I have 3 versions, but one is a modification. The 2 versions that I started off with were a player's map version and a GM version. Now, why would I necessarily want to do this? Well, if you ever look at maps as how they were created, back in before we had things like, satellites and lasers and GPS and all that, there was a good amount of error in them. A lot of maps were very stylistic. A lot of maps gave impressions. Some were extremely accurate, but those were also the maps that were generally commissioned by governments or very rich private industries who needed those accurate maps to be able to know where the resources were, where to go along coastlines. And so I took that idea and said, for the players, I don't mind them knowing what is what and what is where. They should know the rough borders of where the various duchies are and where the major cities are and where the major roads are. But it's not necessarily going to be accurate. And it's not necessarily going to show all of the details. And as things happen, sometimes things change. So some features that were there may no longer be there. So I created one map, and then what I did is for the player's map, I turned off a lot of the features. I also turned off the hex grid, and I shuffled a few things around more to make it look artistic than to be actual reality. And then what I did is I printed those off and made images of them and made them freely available to everybody. Now, the fun part of this is watching the players learn how to use these maps, learn the way things are, and then argue with me when, wait a minute, the forest is here and we went this far. Well, that map's probably not too accurate. You might want to spend some gold and hire somebody to correct that for you. But it is a good tool for them to get a good idea of roughly where they are and where things are at. Now, the GM's map, as you might guess, is extremely accurate. And I maintain this version pretty much after every session. If I need to correct something or add something, I will go back to the map, I'll go back to the key and update it. And for my key, I use Google Docs, which has a very nice feature of versioning, so that if I ever wanted to go back and see what was in this particular location, 2, 3, 4 years ago, I can look at those versions until I find the changes and see how it's been modified. The GM's map also has all of the roads, all of the trails, and all of the details that I need so that I can describe things and let the players know what they're finding. But I make it their responsibility to maintain their own maps and to maintain their own level of detail. I know that some players have taken a lot of effort and time to keep their versions of their maps fairly, up to date and accurate as far as they can. That's becoming actually very important lately because my players are traveling far from where their home base is. They've actually gone many days south, and they're in a whole new duchy right now. So they are having to explore a whole new area and rely on these players' maps to give them a starting point. I also maintain a version of the GM's map, which is more of, I call it my wartime status. So what that does is I have colored what is orc held, what is chaos held versus what is human held. And it's just a nice way for me to see at a glance on a season-by-season basis how things have changed. So that way, as I'm relaying information to the players, I can give them an idea. Well, half of that duchy has fallen to the orcs, so that's why you're seeing a lot of refugees. And it's just a nice visual aid for me. So those are my 3 maps. Maintaining them really is only about maintaining the GM's map. The players' maps, by and large, once I generated them, I'm pretty much done with them, and so the players can do with them what they will. The GM's map is updated really in two key circumstances. One is when it's needed. Falling on the example of my players going into the Southern Duchy, they've never been here, so I didn't have all of the hex by hex features that I may need that I needed. I had the major cities, I had the major roads, but now that they're heading in these directions and I got a good idea of where they're going, what I'm doing is I'm doing some generation using some spreadsheets and things I kind of developed, tuned for my campaign, to tell me, is something in this hex? Is it, a major feature that they're probably going to find by default, or is it a minor feature that they may or may not run into? Once I have that information, then I can put a symbol on the map. I can, make sure that I know that, something is there or something is not there, and, go on. I'm try to be about 2 to 3 sessions ahead of the players. So, to the best of my knowledge, I know where they want to head, and I know a roughly logical path that they might take. So I'll try to fill in the hexes around that direction, and then I'll imagine what if they decide to go crazy and do something else. And so I'll try to anticipate that and put a few things in there as well. Although I will know those features, I won't necessarily fill in the details until they're very close to getting there. So, along their path, there may be a castle, there may be a set of ruins, there be a monster lair, there may be a village. And I'll know that that's coming up, but I haven't filled in the details. So, when they get closer to these things, then I'll generate, who the NPCs are and what's the monster and is there anything in this ruins and so on. Some things I am going ahead and predetermining. They are heading to a set of ruins. It's likely that there's some sort of a dungeon or some sort of a, area that they need to explore. So I am beginning the process of mapping that out. So although, it's not necessarily just in time, I'm kind of saving myself a little bit of work down the road by doing it now. I did mention that, for me, my hex map is at a scale of 1 day's travel on foot. And that's roughly about 24 miles. I know some people don't do that. Some people like to get into a lot more detail within the hex and so on. My experience is I haven't had to use that. It's almost, I guess, to use a phrase that I've heard, it's almost like my hex maps turn into point maps. So, they travel to a location, takes them a couple of days, they move through the terrain. And then once they get to this point, it's really more about, okay, I know that there's a town here, so I'm going to travel to that town, and I'm going to go about, half a day to the west. And we want to go to the monastery that we're used to going to. Okay, I didn't need to have a detailed child map to show that. It was more established during play that, they go to the town, they head west, they look for the crossroads, the broken tree, whatever have you, and they're there. So, I have a good idea of the relationship when I've developed out the hex, between the major features and the minor features. Or if not, it just comes out in play, What do I feel like? What do I see in my head? What do I imagine? Or maybe the players have an idea and they say, oh, we're heading to this spooky place, so I bet it's, by a graveyard. And, okay, yeah, that's exactly it. You're right. That kind of thing. Another thing is the idea of how many villages, how many hamlets, what is inside of a hex. You look at some of these maps back from Greyhawk and Blackmore and what have you, and I got the impression that the density, the population density and the settlement density was really very low. You almost felt like you were in a type of deserted lands. In my campaign, most of the lands that the players are traveling through were at one time heavily populated. Roughly, I say heavily populated for a medieval type setting, but they're not as empty. So you should be running into several villages per hex. And I have a little approach that I use to generate a random village or hamlet on the fly if they want to stay somewhere for the evening. A couple of dice throws, and they have a place to sleep and a place to drink and get rumors on where there's crap to find, and there's a place for them to repair their crap or to buy more crap or to sell their crap. Generally, that's what adventurers want to do as they're traveling, unless they're heading to a certain location, or I've generated this village as a major feature, so I've added a little something to it. Here's a good example. Out in orc-held territory, I generated a village as a major feature, and it was supposed, the random generator said, this is supposed to have some sort of an odd magical effect. When I got to thinking about it, I'm like, well, how would a village of humans survive surrounded by orc armies? Ooh, I know. It's actually cloaked. For whatever reason, the old village wizard cast a mighty spell, that allows the village to actually coexist cloaked as long as people don't keep entering and leaving the village. So, as the orcs ride by, they see nothing but, grassland. If an orc happens to stumble inside the enchantment, well, then he or they are quickly dispatched. And the villagers made it work for a number of years until, of course, the players ran into it, and then things happened, and the orcs found it, but there's consequences there. But that was an example of a village that I generated that had to be there. But as the players move through this hex, it's not where a village is uncommon. At least in my campaign, they're going to run into several during the day. Let's see. So I talked about the scale. Oh, the population. So, and maybe this should be a future topic. I kind of got a little obsessed for a little while and went down the rabbit hole of medieval demographics. And as I mentioned, when I looked at some of the examples back from the early days of D&D, it really felt like that these lands that you would travel through, that you would read about in the modules, they just didn't feel very populated. At least that was my experience. I didn't read much into Mystara and some like Forgotten Realms and some of the later campaign settings, so maybe that was different. My experience was it felt like we were in lost lands. So I didn't have a really good example of how to generate a population and how that population would look inside my map. So I used stuff that I just dug up from reading blogs, reading books, going online and researching medieval demographics. There actually is a ton of information and a couple of really interesting generators based on actual medieval population numbers and economics that can help you get started if you're designing a campaign and you want to design something in one specific way or another. For me, I came up with a population for each kingdom based on the kind of land it was and the kind of economy they had. And that gave me enough numbers to break it down into, okay, how many villages, how many towns, how many, what's the population spread going to be among each? And then I've saved that information off so that as I'm going through and I'm filling in the map, I'll have a good idea of, okay, this duchy's really rich. So you're probably going to run into a lot more towns, a lot more villages. You're going to have an easier time getting stuff than maybe if you go over into this area of a neighboring duchy, and this area is not quite as resourceful. So you're not going to have as many villages. You're not going to have as many people. That was kind of hard to put on a map. So I ended up using more of my key and just notes per location and notes per duchy to keep track of that information. And I'll go back and look at that as I'm generating, the maps and getting detailed because the players are going there. So what about dungeon maps? What about specific locations themselves? Well, I cheat on dungeons. Unless it's a dungeon for a major location that I really have a good feeling about, I just use random dungeons that I either find on the internet. I like going to the one-page dungeon contest compilations. There's usually some really good dungeons in there I'll grab. I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, Dyson Logos with his just hundreds of maps that he has on his website that he keeps creating. I steal those liberally and shuffle those around and make those into dungeons. Same thing for towns and villages. Now that I have the luxury that there's usually a lot of neat maps or pictures available from medieval times that I can go and steal if the players want a detailed map. But one of the things I found is that unless it's a major location where they're going to spend a lot of time, they don't really care what the layout is. So I've learned that I don't have to put a lot of detail into it unless it's a place that they're going to spend time at. Like I said, most of the time the players care about three things: where to buy their stuff, where to sell the stuff, and where to buy things to help me get more stuff or to find out about where the stuff is. So my advice to you is with all of this is don't sweat it until you need it, and there's lots of tools out there that you can get to help you if you're pressed for time or you just need a good starting place. So that's really all I wanted to cover about how I do mapping and what I put on my maps. I hope you found this informative. Like I mentioned, I'm going to put the links to some examples of my maps. Some of the GM maps may be a little fuzzy because I don't want the players to see everything, and I know that they do look at my blogs. And I'll also put a link for Worldographer. As I mentioned, I really highly recommend that you grab this tool and use it for generating your hex maps. All right, well, that's about it for this episode. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to tell you again that I really appreciate all the comments, all the suggestions. I really do appreciate the reviews and the shares and the retweets on Twitter and the shouts out on Reddit and across the various blogs and on Google Plus and on Facebook. Please keep passing the podcast information around and let me know what you think and what you'd like to hear about in the future. I do have a really exciting, cool thing related to campaign creation coming up here in the next couple of episodes. I'm going to have my first guest. In fact, he is a podcaster and vlogger, and I'm really looking forward to us putting our heads together and seeing what crazy stuff we can come up with. And one final thing, if I haven't mentioned it before, please do check out my 3 Hexes campaign starters. I've started a weekly blog series on my chicagowiz-games.blogspot.com. That's my RPG blog. Check them out. Every week I post a 3-hex campaign starter with a different theme or a different approach. Some are for space campaigns, some are for fantasy, some are for post-apocalyptic or, any sort of mutant sci-fi game you want to have. But they're meant to give you great starting points as well as to show you don't need a lot to start a cool campaign. So I hope you'll check those out. Okay, thanks for listening, and until next time, game on.